For 14 years in the 9th century, the mighty Abbasid Caliphate was nearly brought to its knees by a massive rebellion of enslaved Africans in southern Iraq. Led by a charismatic prophet, the Zanj, as they were called, waged a guerrilla war from the marshes, sacked one of the empire's greatest cities, and established their own state. For over 1,000 years, the story, written by their enemies, was one of pure apocalypse. A revolt so brutal it shattered the region's economy, leaving the land barren, and its sophisticated irrigation systems in ruins forever. That has been the accepted truth. But today, the soil itself is telling a different story. Groundbreaking archaeology, using satellite imagery and advanced dating techniques, is challenging the ancient texts. It suggests the economic collapse never happened. This is the story of how science is forcing us to revisit one of history's most dramatic rebellions, pitting the words of ancient historians against the hard evidence buried in the earth. To understand the revolt, you first have to understand the world that created it. In the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was a global superpower. Its capital, Baghdad, was a center of science and culture. But this golden age was fueled by brutal labor. In the wetlands of what is now southern Iraq, near the port city of Basra, wealthy elites had a grand plan: turn the vast salt marshes into profitable farmland. This was grueling work. It meant draining swamps and, more importantly, scraping away the salty topsoil to get to the fertile earth beneath, all to grow cash crops like sugarcane and dates. To do this, they imported tens of thousands of enslaved people, referred to in the texts as the Zanj. While the name is linked to the Swahili coast of East Africa, scholars now believe the term may have been a general one for black Africans, many of whom might have arrived via the trans-Saharan trade routes. Whatever their origin, their condition was inhuman. They were housed in massive work camps, some with up to 5,000 people. The historical accounts, even those hostile to the Zanj, describe a life of endless toil under a scorching sun, with barely enough food to survive and constant cruelty from overseers. This wasn't household slavery. It was an industrial-scale agricultural machine, a tinderbox of suffering just waiting for a spark. That spark arrived in 869 CE in the form of a man named Ali ibn Muhammad. A free Arab or Persian of mysterious origins, he claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad's family and possessed a genius for revolution. He went directly to the slave camps, delivering a powerful message of social and religious liberation. He promised freedom, wealth, and an end to their oppression. One historian, al-Tabari, records him telling the slave masters to their faces, "I wanted to behead you all for the way you have treated these slaves, in ways that Allah has forbidden." He adopted the radical ideology of a dissident Islamic sect, declaring that the best person should lead, even if he is an Abyssinian slave. This message electrified not only the Zanj but also other poor and marginalized people in the area. And so, in September 869, the rebellion began. Ali and his followers ambushed work gangs, freed the enslaved, and armed them. Their numbers swelled with every raid. They used the labyrinthine marshlands to their full advantage, mastering guerrilla warfare. They would conduct swift night attacks on towns and army camps, seizing weapons and supplies, before vanishing back into the dense reeds and waterways where the Abbasid army couldn't follow. What started as scattered raids quickly evolved into a full-fledged state. Deep in the marshes, the Zanj built a fortified capital city they called Al-Mukhtara, or the Chosen. It was a military and political headquarters, complete with a navy to control the rivers, a system for collecting taxes, and even its own minted currency. The Abbasid government, distracted by other conflicts, badly underestimated the threat. Early military campaigns against the Zanj ended in disaster, with imperial armies being lured into the marshes and annihilated. Emboldened, the Zanj went on the offensive. They captured the major port of Al-Ubullah and took control of parts of southwestern Iran. Then came the rebellion's terrifying peak. In September 871, after a long and brutal siege, the Zanj forces captured Basra, one of the empire's wealthiest and most important cities. The historical accounts describe days of horrific massacre and plunder. While the claim of 300,000 dead is likely an exaggeration, modern historians agree that tens of thousands of the city's inhabitants were killed. Basra was burned and looted by the very people who had been enslaved to create its wealth. The fall of Basra sent a shockwave across the Islamic world. It was a stunning humiliation for the Caliphate and proved the Zanj were a power to be reckoned with. Our main source for these events is the historian al-Tabari, who was living in Baghdad as the rebellion unfolded. His account, written from the perspective of the ruling elite, is utterly hostile. He calls the Zanj leader the enemy of God and portrays the 14-year war as an unmitigated disaster for southern Iraq. The texts describe chaos and ruin, trade routes severed, and agriculture grinding to a halt. Crucially, they state that the irrigation systems, the very canals and fields the Zanj had been forced to build, were destroyed, and the region's economy collapsed, never to recover. This story of total and permanent devastation, of a slave revolt so destructive it wiped out a sophisticated agricultural system, became the accepted history for more than 1,000 years. But history isn't just written in ink, it's also written in dirt. And starting in 2022, archaeologists began to read what the dirt had to say. An international team of researchers used high-resolution satellite imagery to map a massive, mysterious network of over 7,000 ancient earthen ridges and canals spread across 800 square kilometers of the Iraqi floodplain. For decades, everyone assumed these were the remains of the system the Zanj had built and which their rebellion had destroyed. To find out, the team used a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL dating. OSL can determine the last time sediment grains were exposed to sunlight, effectively telling you when an earthen structure, like a canal ridge, was built or last maintained. The results were stunning. They completely contradicted the historical texts. The OSL dates showed that the agricultural system was not abandoned in the 9th century. In fact, it was actively used, maintained, and even expanded for centuries after the Zanj Rebellion was crushed. Dates from the ridges extended into the 11th, 12th, and even 13th centuries. The physical evidence is clear. The economic impact of the Zanj Rebellion was not the long-term catastrophe the chroniclers described. There was no permanent collapse. While the war itself was incredibly brutal and destructive, causing immense loss of life and the sacking of cities, it did not kill the region's agricultural heart. Farming continued, and may have even been reorganized, for another 300 to 400 years. So how do we reconcile these two completely different stories? Was al-Tabari just lying? Probably not. It's about perspective. Al-Tabari and his colleagues were writing from the capital, for the elite. Their narrative was shaped by the immediate trauma of the war. The burning of Basra and the slaughter of its people were real, horrific events. They were chronicling the shock and horror of the conflict, not conducting a long-term economic impact study. The destruction they described, bridges smashed, canals blocked, was likely real but temporary. It's one thing to damage a canal for a military advantage. It's another to erase an entire agricultural landscape built over generations. The archaeology, on the other hand, reveals the slower rhythms of life. Once the war was over, the economic realities returned. The cities still needed food. The land was still fertile. The knowledge of how to manage the complex irrigation system wasn't lost. Life, and the labor needed to sustain it, simply went on. The real end of this massive agricultural system seems to have come much later, sometime in the 13th or 14th century. The reasons aren't certain, but they may be tied to much larger events, like climate change or the devastating Mongol invasions, which caused far more permanent destruction across the region. The end of the rebellion itself was a long and bloody affair. The caliph's brother, al-Muwaffaq, took personal command of the war. Starting in 879, he brought a massive army and a fleet and began a slow, grinding siege. He blockaded the marshes, built his own fortified towns, and gradually pushed the rebels back. He also offered amnesty and a place in the Abbasid army to any Zanj who defected, a tactic that drained the rebellion of experienced fighters. After a grueling 2-year siege of the Zanj capital, al-Mukhtar fell in August 883. Ali ibn Muhammad was killed in the final battle. The Zanj Rebellion was one of the bloodiest upheavals in the history of the medieval world. It exposed the deep social and racial fault lines of the Abbasid Empire. But as modern science now shows, its legacy is far more complex than the story told by its enemies. It did not permanently destroy the economy of southern Iraq. Instead, the landscape itself testifies to an incredible resilience, a continuity of life and labor that outlasted the violence of the war. The conversation between the ancient texts and the new archaeological data is a powerful lesson. It shows that history is never a closed book. The voices of the historians tell us about the fire and fury of the moment. But the silent testimony of the soil can reveal a deeper story of survival, adaptation, and the relentless human drive to make the earth productive, even in the shadow of unimaginable conflict. The history of the Zanj Rebellion is not just being revisited, it is being rewritten, one grain of sand at a time.